Welcome everybody. Today is May 4th, 2021, and I'm happy to see all of you in our Stand for Israel meeting, our weekly meeting on Tuesday. We're doing it again in a distance meeting via Zoom because of the pandemic. Topics today are Holocaust Rescuers with JoAnn, and she prepared, in addition to the wonderful presentation, to this really heartwarming a topic. She also prepared a great quiz for all of us to do after that. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm going to give some updates from Israel first. My presentation is a little bit upside down, but that's okay. I'm going to go first to my pages at the end, and we will do that. And I want to first thank to all the co-sponsors of our meetings, which you can see on your screen right now. As I said, we are recording, so I did give a warning for people about how to stop their video or mute their microphone if they don't want to be seen or heard. I want to thank each and every one of you on joining us today on this beautiful spring day. And I also want to thank Pastor Mac and Pastor Lynn Hammond, because if it wasn't for them, we would not have been here together, all of us coming from different backgrounds, organizations, and walks of life, and we all get together in support of Israel, and that always warms my heart. I want to thank Dave and Nancy Smith, our ongoing volunteers. I'm waiting for the day when we'll be back at the Living Word at our regular meeting place, and they will keep on always doing, they're serving our meeting in just a beautiful way. Thank you so much. And yes, of course, to JoAnn and Deb, thank you so much. My co-partners. Nothing warmed my heart more than partnering with my Christian friends, these two wonderful ladies that care about Israel and love Israel and dedicating everything that they do every day to Israel. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to co-host this series of meetings with you. As I said, today we're going to have Holocaust Rescuers with JoAnn, and I will do news from Israel, but I kind of changed the order. We decided to go ahead, so I'm going to go into the news. Just for everyone, if for some reason you don't find my email and you want to, meaning when we communicate about a meeting, you can always find the links and the basic information at this website that is on your screen right now.
All right, everybody can see. Very good.
We can see. Thank you.
Well, this is a PowerPoint that I was given years ago when I was studying at Yad Vashem. I've done probably 5 or 6 different classes at Yad Vashem over the years, beginning back in the 80s when I was working for the Christian Embassy, and we had developed a relationship with Yad Vashem, and they wanted some of our American members of the ICEJ to be trained at Yad Vashem, and we were happy to do that. And I've tried to update, some of the material on this film because it's not a film, it's a PowerPoint. But anyway, it was developed some years ago, and I try to keep upgrading it. And I've been working on that with many of the PowerPoints that I've used over the years in our crazy last year. So it's given me time to do some of that. And Ilan is adding the audio to these PowerPoints as we're doing them, which makes them more useful for other people to use in the future once I am graduated up to the grand banquet on high. So anyway, but I'm wondering how many of you have ever been to Yad Vashem, but we can't see a show of hands right now, so we can talk about that later. But I added this slide tonight because that's the upgrade of the whole museum complex there in Jerusalem. And it's much classier, much improved over the years since it started back in the 1950s. But the idea of Yad Vashem was to provide a museum and a study center where the events of the Holocaust could be recorded and researched, and educational material would keep being produced. And one of the problems we have in America these days is that really history is being taught rather badly in many of our public schools and colleges. And those of us who take history seriously and who want our children and our families in the future to know these things and be able to look at our current events from a historical perspective, I think we're going to have to be take more initiative ourselves to teach children who are going to school in Christian and Jewish schools. And many of the people on this call are involved with Living Word and Maranatha School. And Ilan and I have both taught some classes there, but they always have a priority of teaching about Jewish history and Christian-Jewish relations. But many of the schools in America today and many of the school districts have pretty much rewritten history so that it makes the Islamic influence on things look like the original, and the Jews are not mentioned, and that is a tragedy. So, but it's also important for all of us to meet some of the people who were rescuers, because today we're living in another complicated period of history that will demand some wisdom and some courage on our part as to what should we push back on and what should we just let go. And that's not an easy thing. So we'll kind of look at these things. Hope if we can't finish it all tonight, we can finish next week, but we'll see what we can do here. This is the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. This was from the original area that's been upgraded a bit in recent years. But the whole idea of the name of Yad Vashem is always a little hard for people to understand. Pardon me for my cough, it's hay fever season. Anyway, it's based on a scripture from Isaiah 56:5. It says, I will give them in my house and in my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall never be effaced. And as that whole scripture chapter goes together, it's clear that God isn't talking just about the Jews, but also about people who stand with them and help them. And so anyway, the lower picture here is the Garden of the Righteous. They've planted so many trees. Each of these trees is named for a rescuer, but they kind of ran out of space. So now they're putting names in the wall, and rather than an individual tree, you've got groups of people being memorialized by each of the trees. And here you see an example of the kind of thing that is at the foot of the tree in these other areas. This is Oskar Schindler's memorial site. And this is a kind of a forest where, again, some of the trees are planted in honor of various rescuers, the Garden of the Righteous. Those who are rescuers are called the righteous among the nations, and that is a high honor. Here's the new building at Yad Vashem. When you looked at the aerial view, you could see that there's this triangular shaped building. And if you've been to the museum, you go back and forth across the inner hallway to see one exhibit after another. It's very amazingly done. It's a wonderful museum, wonderful and sad and frightening. But the name is a bit of a puzzle because Yad in Hebrew, many of you who've done a little study of Hebrew know the phrase Yad b'Yad, which means hand in hand. Yad is actually the word for hand, but it's also used as a word for a place or a memorial. And what do you do with your hand? You place it somewhere. So it makes sense, as far as language goes. And then Shem, of course, is the word for name. So God is promising both to the Jewish people and to those who stand with them a place and a name. And the importance of names, because so many people in the concentration camps were given numbers, and people died and they're buried in a mass grave. Their name is not remembered anywhere. And that is the big emphasis of the work that goes on at Yad Vashem, to find the actual names of people who were lost, people who knew that their family member went to Auschwitz and never came home, all of those things. So again, and Isaiah says, I will give them a place and a name. So if that makes a little more sense of the designation of that particular name for the place. Anyway, the study of the Holocaust is really interesting. A lot of people say to me, oh, how can you stand, having spent so much time studying such a terrible, unpleasant, frightening time of history? But I think it's really important to remember it. And I got into this actually pretty early in the game, back in the late 1940s, when I was in junior high. My grandmother, who had been my spiritual mentor, had died and left me with a sense that we were responsible to tell the story of the Jews. And even though it's been a tragic story in many places, when I look back over my nearly 84 years of life, and starting at probably age 10, I began looking for more information about what happened. It's been not pleasant, but it's been a really challenging, and for me, it's been a real blessing. I look back over my life and I think, I'm glad that people didn't talk me out of studying the Holocaust. It's been a real blessing. But one of the things you learn quickly is Holocaust scholars identify, pardon me, three main categories of people who were alive and in some way participating because they lived in Europe at that time of history. And who were the perpetrators, the ones who, the Nazis and all of their supporters who killed people, who sent them to camps, who tortured them and made them victims. And then there's a large number of victims. And probably one of the largest number is the bystanders, those who looked but didn't do anything. And then there are a few rescuers. But less than 1% of the non-Jewish Europeans became rescuers. And it's really important that we honor the rescuers. There's something like 27,000 rescuers identified at this stage of history. But there were just a couple more US rescuers who've been identified in about the last 10 years. So the research goes on at Yad Vashem. It's such an interesting place. I wouldn't mind going back for another session. It was usually like 6-week sessions, sometimes 12 weeks. And but it's been a really valuable thing to know. We should honor the rescuers, but remember that there were very, very few of them. That was not a popular activity. It wasn't something people wanted to become. One of the rescuers that I've met personally, I mean, not to the way that he would have remembered me, but I was at a meeting where he spoke back in about 1983. And Jan Karsky, who was born in 1914 and died in 2000, was a Polish army officer. And a book is written about him called The Man Who Tried to Stop the Holocaust. He was smuggled out of Poland, made a trip to London, and then from there to Washington, D.C. in 1943 and 44, and 42 and 43, I guess it was. Anyway, he spoke with government officials, and in Washington, he actually met with President Roosevelt and one of the Supreme Court members, the Jewish Supreme Court member who was named, what was his name? Now I've forgotten, I know it perfectly well, but Frankfurter, Felix Frankfurter. Anyway, and he heard the story from Karsky, who made it he had been through all sorts of near death himself, been tortured and persecuted. He was part of the Polish army that was arrested by the Russians, and 27,000 of the Polish army officers in 1940, when the Russians took them over, even before the Nazis arrived, they killed off this huge number of Polish army officers, the Katyn Forest massacre it's referred to. And Karsky was an officer, but he had been wise enough to make sure that he had his old non-official uniform from when he was a private in the army. And the Nazis were going to trade some prisoners with the Russians before the Russians got left out altogether and partnered with the West. But anyway, they were going to trade some prisoner groups back and forth. And the Russians were only willing to have the people survive who were the lower army people, the privates, the corporals, people like that. And they were planning, after all this was done, to kill off all the officers. Well, he figured out that's what they were going to do. So when they called for all of the privates and corporals to go to a particular place and be traded, he had a lower ranking uniform on, and he was the only one of the officers who lived through that terrible time. And later than that, after that, he had many Jewish friends, and some of them smuggled him in to the areas where the Jews were being rounded up. It's debatable which of the concentration or which of the death camps he visited. He thought he had gone to Belzec, but there's been, he wasn't exactly sure where he was being taken because he was blindfolded. So, he wouldn't see some of the things. Anyway, he eventually then was sent to London. And when I encountered him, it was in 1983, when my dear friend and longtime travel agent, Peggy Goldman, and her family, they were all survivors. She was born in Łódź, Poland at the end of the war. Her parents had been traveling farther and farther eastward and came back on a bicycle with no tires, and gave birth to their first child, Peggy, in June of 1945. But anyway, they eventually came to America, and they were part of a group of people who started having annual Holocaust teaching sessions in America using the existing survivors that were still around. And they invited Jan Karsky, who at that time was teaching at Georgetown in Washington. After he made it to Washington, where nobody listened to him, but they let him stay, and he went to college here and then became a professor. And it turned out this was the first time he had ever told this story in a large public place. He's written a couple of books, and there's a book written about him. But in the early 80s was when Peggy's father and some of the survivors who'd been doing research on rescuers heard about him and invited him to come to Philadelphia and speak for their group. And I was there with a few other friends who were, involved in Holocaust studies, and we'd been good friends, become good friends of Peggy and her family. So her father and this other fellow who was one of the survivors who knew about Karsky, they were both really short, little Eastern European Jewish guys, about 5 foot tall, and he's about 6 feet tall. And he sounded, when he gave his speech, as though he was very, wasn't closely connected with it. It was like it was something from a distance. And he read off his speech and spoke with a fairly thick Polish accent, but it was an amazing story of all that he'd been through. He spoke for about 20 minutes and he collapsed on the floor. we had all thought that he was, just so firmly in charge of everything. He just was, but of course he was just trying not to pass out. It was such a shock to his system to have to tell this story to a large group. And I'd love to get a photograph of what happened next, because Peggy's dad and this other fellow, who were these small Jewish middle-aged men, were trying to pick him up off the floor and, fan his face and get him some water. Because when he first, fell down, we all thought, is he dead? I mean, it was really a shocking time. But anyway, he was a pretty amazing person. And he made this quote years ago: "This sin of the Holocaust will haunt humanity till the end of time. It does haunt me, and I want it to be so." And when I heard him say that, I thought, yeah, that's how I feel about it too. I was never in on it like he was, but to know about it, it does haunt me, and I don't want that to go away. I want to be reminded that that's my responsibility to tell the story. And he also said he learned a profound lesson as a result of his efforts to bring the news of the Holocaust to the world. The humanity of people, not the power of governments, is the only real protector of human rights. And he learned that in spades when he went to Washington and talked to Roosevelt. And there's an interview with him. If some of this gets you really interested in going a little deeper with it, it's online. You can get the tape or the movie of him telling that story about how when he met with Frankfurter and Roosevelt, that Roosevelt pretended, well, and probably was really interested, but he wanted to know, he wanted to say, oh yes, we will protect Poland, your country will be safe, Americans are on your side. Well, of course, eventually they weren't. I mean, they gave that to the Russians, and Poland was under communism for the next 40 years. But anyway, and America did nothing. We did not bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz, and we could have. And there are reasons, and it's complicated, and it's really not fair to blame the people who made decisions in history that we know what the end result was and they don't. But anyway, the story he was telling was how he had traveled. He had done 3 different missions of research after he had come back from Russia, and visited various places that were becoming death camps in Poland. And he was over here near Krakow, and first he made this trip around, visited various different places and tried to find out what was happening. And then some of the Polish underground army had realized what he was doing. And so they asked him to take a 4th mission in 1942. And the blue line is the places he visited at that point in time. Starts over here in near Warsaw and goes through Poland and up into Berlin and all around down here into Belgium and Paris and Lyon in France. And he had gone to a meeting in Algiers, which is a long story too. But anyway, eventually he came down, and this is it's a good map of Europe to see. We can print it out sometime if you're really interested. But anyway, he winds up down here in Spain at Gibraltar, and then he takes a ship and goes up here to London. And Churchill was too busy to meet with him, but a number of London, UK officials did meet with him and got the story. And they had concurred that he really should go to Washington and talk to Roosevelt, which he did. And he sailed across the Atlantic and wound up over there. But it's a famous story that when he talked to Roosevelt, Roosevelt was interested, but he said, well, there's nothing we can do about the Jews. We will eventually rescue them. They will be rescued, but we can't do that right now. And he said, we have to concentrate on winning the war, And whenever I hear that voice, so I think of 1941 when it was my grandma's birthday and the war started when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and Roosevelt came on the radio and he always said war like that. We will win the war. Anyway, then Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court justice, was there, and he's Jewish. And when Karsky was telling that story of how the Nazis were building all these camps in Poland, and by that time it's 1942, and the whole Wannsee conference has gone on, and they're building the 6 death factories and the multitude of small holding camps along the way. And he was telling that story to a Jewish Supreme Court justice. And when he finished the story, he said he was just exhausted. And Frankfurter looked at him and said, I can't believe him. I can't believe this story. And the ambassador from Poland, who was in Washington with him, said, Felix, you can't call this man a liar. And he said, I didn't say he was a liar. I said, I can't accept this story. I can't believe it. So anyway, Karsky stayed in America and eventually wrote some books and didn't become very well known until he spoke at that conference in Philadelphia. But anyway, a lot more to that story. As I was preparing this presentation, I thought, oh, I really should do another presentation later about the full story of some of these people, because it really is so interesting. But we have victims and survivors, the young one, Anne Frank. And Anne Frank's story was available early in the 50s. And I began looking for more stories, and Elie Wiesel's autobiography, which he'd written in French. He was living in France right after escaping. And that was translated into English in 1960. So the 50s to me were a frustrating time. I was trying to find out what happened, and nobody in America was very interested in it. We were all so glad the war is over. We don't have to have coupons to buy sugar and coffee and gas, and let's not think about the past. And I was pretty hungry to know about the past, so I'm really glad I've found as much information as I have. But some of the best known victims are Elie Wiesel, and of course Anne Frank, and Primo Levi, who was in Auschwitz and was heading back to Greece, where he had been a chemist before the war. And then here's 2 people who actually she's a Polish survivor, and he's from Hungary, from Budapest, but both of them wound up in Minnesota. Some of you might have met Lucy Smith. She spoke out at Living Word to the high school students a few years ago, and she's a little bitty person, about 4'9", and has lots of stories to tell. And so she's here in the classroom at Maranatha, and the kids have written on the board, "Thank you for coming, Lucy Smith." And then there's Dr. Robert Fish, who was a physician and a research physician at the University of Minnesota for many years. And he's in his 90s now. And we get a Christmas card from him every year at the library at Living Word. He has spoken at Living Word when we first started. So anyway, Robert Fish is one of our local survivors, and he has another powerful story. And there's about 27,000 rescuers that have been identified at this time of history, and it's still going on. Miep Gies, you might remember, she was the employee of Otto Frank, who hid the Frank family in the attic there, and she was the one who tried to rescue them. And Irina Sendler, I think some of you might have heard her story. She was a Polish social worker who smuggled about 2,500 babies and small children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, and was eventually caught and imprisoned by the Nazis. She was beaten and tortured and sent to that horrible prison in Warsaw. And years went by, and she's not able to walk without a wheelchair, but she was still an interesting person, and she got married and worked hard. And then later in her life, well, she was in her 90s and still in a nursing home, some kids in a little town in Kansas were assigned to write a 10-minute play about somebody they had read of who had done something courageous. And the 3 high school girls found her story somewhere in the files, and they contacted Yad Vashem. They assumed that she was dead, but they thought Yad Vashem could provide them with more information. And they wrote back and said, actually, she's still living in a nursing home in Warsaw. So they wrote this story, which was a really nice little short play about her. And then one of the local Jewish families in their area read the story and donated money for these 3 girls and their teacher to go to Warsaw and spent some time with Irina Sendler. And it was such a bright spot in her life after her story was really ignored and nobody knew about it till these girls actually wrote the play, and then more people got interested. So she died a few years ago too, but another amazing person. And there's Pastor Andre Tracme from the town in France, Les Chambon, where he challenged his congregation. When they were in the part of France where the Nazis were kind of allowing the French to still run their own government. And then eventually the Nazis took over full stop. And then they were looking all over for anybody who was hiding Jews. And he'd been involved with the hiding effort at Les Chambon, where farmers in the area, people of various sorts who didn't know each other. It was a town that was mainly Huguenot, or Huguenot, depending on how you pronounce it, but it's a Protestant denomination, kind of on the order of the Quakers and things like that. But and then there were also a Catholic minority in the town, and those people all got together, and everybody in the town participated, and they saved 5,000 children, mainly Jewish children. And so that was another wonderful story. And that the movie. Okay, now I can't think of the name of the movie. Oh, well, I have a copy of it. I'll get it. Weapons of the Spirit. The trouble with getting over 80 is sometimes the little file in the back of your head runs slowly. And of course, there's Corrie ten Boom, and everybody knows her story, and Schindler's Factory in Krakow. If you go with us to Krakow, to Poland sometime, that's an interesting place. They've turned it into a really interesting museum, and that's well worth seeing. And Hiram Bingham, who was an Israeli, born in Israel, but he left before the war, became a very famous educator, wrote a book called Teacher and Child. But he had been in Israel and in Europe long enough to have been in a concentration camp. He managed to escape and come to America, but he's a famous educator. And his first book that he wrote for teachers had this foreword to it: "I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students to become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human." He always said, we must strive to produce mensches. A mensch is, of course, a good person in Yiddish. So the rescuers, prior to the war, the people who became rescuers were not yet saints or even necessarily saintly. And the people who became killers were not yet villains or even necessarily villainous. And that's Raoul Hilberg, who wrote the Perpetrators, Victims, and Bystanders books. But in this whole program that they were working on at Yad Vashem, they were trying to identify the demographics of the rescuers, where they came from, the traits, the motivation, the methods of rescue, individuals who rescued, diplomats who rescued, governments that rescued, the righteous among the nations. And what's interesting about this is it isn't just one type of person. We who are charismatic Christians and believe that Christianity motivates us to do good things, and it should, we would like to say, oh, all the rescuers were Christians. All the rescuers were not Christians. And we'll be learning more about them here. Rescuers came from every country that the Nazis occupied, even the ones where there wasn't much support. They were all of different ages. There wasn't, a group of teenagers, although it was easier for teenagers without families to worry about to get involved in the underground work, which often happened. But they were from various social classes. They were from all educational levels. We would like to think that intelligent people were more likely to rescue, but that wasn't the case. They were from different economic spheres. We often think, well, people who have money and who have the ability to help people would be more likely to help. But sometimes it was the poorest person who had nothing. They were from different political beliefs. It wasn't just the right wing or the left wing. And that's something we need to remember in our time too. We're kind of getting divided about right and left. And I think there are reasons why some of us prefer one over the other. But when a push comes to a shove and you got to make a quick decision, various people that you wouldn't expect come forward. And people you would expect often go home and hide. And they were from different religious backgrounds, as I've said, and they were from diverse occupations. So the only thing that united them was that they made a good choice on a bad day. And these were all of this material is based on a project that was going on at Yad Vashem some years ago. And these were the categories they were looking for. What produced moral leadership? What produced self-sacrifice? How about integrity, courage, compassion, cooperation, social responsibility, ingenuity? So these things were all aspects of what drove people to rescue, but they're kind of looking for examples of that. So under the idea of moral leadership, this guy is one of, I think there's 9 government representatives who were sent as ambassadors to different countries, who actually participated in the whole business of rescue in countries where that was needed. But Jorge Ferdinand Duckwitz, or George Duckwitz, he was born in 1904 and died in 1973. I think the birth and death dates are kind of interesting with this group of people because, just seeing the different ages. But he was German. I mean, and Hitler was his boss, and he was sent to Denmark as a representative of the German government. And most of the German, government officials were, singing Hitler's song. But this guy had heard about the fact that the Nazis were going to come to Denmark and round up all the Jews and send them to one of the camps in Poland. And he had heard enough about this, and he wasn't talking about this with his fellow German government officials, but he went to the Danish underground. Every one of these countries had an underground army that, for better or worse, tried to do something. And he told them, and he knew approximately when it was going to happen. And so they really got motivated right away, and ordinary people and, various leadership people began going to the Jewish communities in Denmark and warning them that this was going to happen. And they made plans to send them to neutral Sweden. Now, Sweden, it didn't cover itself with glory during the war, but they did provide a hiding place. And since they were in a neutral state and there weren't any Germans hanging around, well, except for a few spies, so they were willing to take other Scandinavian refugees. The Norwegians sent some of their Jews there also, but this was a major undertaking. And just before the Nazis were planning to arrive in Denmark to pick up all the Jews, they had been sent on ships across the sea here over to Malmo and places like that. In the category of self-sacrifice, Irene Gut, a young Polish woman, is an amazing story. She was a young person who really felt that the Nazis were terrible, wanted to push back on this, worked with an underground medical group. She was a nurse. And then she was fired from that when they suspected she wasn't playing with the right people. And then she kind of wandered around, was in a couple of displaced persons camps. And then she found out that the Nazi leadership was in, I think it was in the town of Krakow. I think it was in Krakow where this happened. But anyway, she was hired to be the cleaning lady at a small hotel for Nazi officers. And the head Nazi officer was a 70-year-old man who thought she was cute. So he kind of kept promoting her, and she got to be the cook in the kitchen. And then she was in charge of cleaning the main floor and welcoming guests and all of that. And he was gone for, days at a time. Well, then she realized they were quite close to a concentration camp. And she began saving the food that was left over from dinner and going to the outside of this camp, and some of the underground people smuggled it in. And she got to know a number of the Jews who were in this camp. And then she was sometimes able to be with them when they were sent outside the camp to clean things and to mow the lawn and all that. She had 12 of them in the basement where this guy never went, the head guy. And this went on for the better part of a year. And then one time he came home a day earlier than she had anticipated him, and all the Jews were working in the kitchen. So he figured out what she was doing. And he had them all lined up ready to take them to turn them into the Nazis. And she got down on her knees and put her arms around his knees and said, "I'll do anything you ask me to do. Please don't give them away." And he said, "Okay, you'll be my mistress." So she had a love affair with him for the next year and a half, I think it was. And the Jews didn't realize that that's what she had done. So, and she was a Catholic girl, a strong Christian, and she had gone to confession and told her priest what was going on. And he said, "Well, it's better for you to save your eternal soul than to save human lives." And she prayed about it and thought, "No, that's not true." So she was on the outs with her priest, but anyway, she did survive the war. And at the end of the war, the United Nations sent people in to rescue people like her who were still in displaced persons camps. And then she got to know this guy a bit, and then she made it to New York and met him on the street, just coincidentally or divine. And they got married, and she was his wife and had a happy life for many years. And again, kind of like Karsky and so many of them, they didn't tell the story right away. And then later she did tell the whole story to some public meetings, and she was honored. All these people have been honored as righteous among the Gentiles at Yad Vashem. And this is modeling the idea of integrity. Jan, and we don't know his last name, but he was a Christian who was working at the first concentration camp that was built in Poland in 1939, Piotrków. Was created in October of 39, was the first known ghetto to have been formed in occupied Poland. And two Jewish kids in this family, Ruska and Benek Gutterman, teenagers who escaped from the ghetto, were hidden by Jan, who is this, we don't even know his last name, a local Polish guy who they found they were in a train station and their train was late, and the Nazis would round up and kill anybody who was on the street between 10 o'clock and 6 in the morning, and they didn't know where to hide. And they saw this guy cleaning outside the train station and told them that they didn't say they were Jewish, of course, but they said they were, waiting for their train and it wouldn't leave till 6 in the morning. And he said, come with me. And they thought, well, maybe he's going to turn us in. All night long, they didn't really trust him. They expected the Nazis to show up, but he took them home, and his wife and kids were just going to bed. And they said, what's going on? And he said, no problem. Just got some people who are going to stay overnight here. And he woke them up at 4 o'clock in the morning and got them down to the train. And when they got to the train, Ruska, the teenage girl, I think she was 18 and her brother was 16. And she wanted to give him some money. He said, you're going to need it more than I do. What they're doing to your people is awful. And then she realized he knew she was Jewish. Another example of courage was this Dr. Adelaide Hautefal. She was French. She'd been trained in Paris, but she got in trouble for wearing a little sign that said, a friend of the Jews. She was a psychiatrist, actually. And she was sent to a camp, and she always wore her friend of the Jews. She was forced to wear a tag when she was deported to Auschwitz, and she spent the last year of the war in Auschwitz, was eventually released, came back to Paris and continued her work. But she didn't again, none of these people made a big deal out of telling their stories. They just went on with life. But she was a real example of courage and pushed back on everything the Nazis tried to make her do. And another one, this woman was a school teacher. She's German, Elizabeth Abeg, and she was dismissed for her anti-Nazi views. She prepared food for Jewish students and prepared hiding places. Later, she sold her own jewelry in order to finance their escapes to neutral Switzerland. So she too is honored at Yad Vashem. And the idea of cooperation, working together for a common goal or purpose. Irina Sendler, born in 1910 and died in 2008, lived to be almost 100, led members of the Zagota, which was the Polish group that was helping the Jews, to rescue children from the Warsaw Ghetto. They led children out through the underground corridors of the courthouse and through a tram depot. They sedated some of the infants and carried them out in potato sacks or coffins. A church located at the edge of the ghetto also became useful. It had two entrances, one inside the Jewish ghetto and one on the Christian side. And Irina was very involved. I think I've told you this story before in some other contexts, but she was very active. She had a little truck that she was allowed to use to bring supplies in for the soldiers, not for the prisoners, of course. But she always had a dog who traveled with her. And when they'd, kind of give the babies some kind of sleeping medicine and put them in the gunny sacks, the dog, if anybody came near them, the dog would bark and just scare them off. So she survived the war, and I've told you that story before. And then there was an unknown Polish Christian, we don't know either of his names, but in Białystok, Poland, which is one of the big cities. The Great Synagogue of Białystok, built in 1908, was the largest wooden synagogue in Eastern Europe. On June 27th in 1941, into the Germans forced 500 to 700 Jews into the synagogue and burned it to the ground. During the chaos, a Polish Christian who'd been employed as a handyman, and we don't know his name, opened a small window at the back of the synagogue where the Nazis weren't looking, and several dozen Jews managed to escape. They never knew the name of their helper, but he saved their lives. And then this guy, there's a book about this story that's always blessed me, but Leopold Soka, he actually had been a burglar in his younger days and was in prison. And then he had been released from prison and was hired to be the director of cleaning the sewers in the town of Lvov in Poland. And he got married and had a daughter. And there was a group of Jews who lived in an apartment building that had a sub-basement. And in the sub-basement, they found that they could make access to the sewer. The sewer mainly carried water, rainwater and water from the river. But of course, there was garbage in it too, and rats. But this Jewish fellow, his family was living on the first floor there. And so they worked for a whole summer cleaning up this area, making a ladder that was hidden underground that could get them into the sewer. And when the Nazis were going to go from house to house and arrest people, they were preparing to go down in the sewer. And they'd been down there several times to see if it was possible, could they breathe down there? And this man and his family were just getting ready to go down when this guy knocked at the door, because he had seen there was some action going on in the sewer and was wondering how people might be getting into it, and was a little suspicious. But anyway, he knocked on their door, and the little girl, Christine, answered the door. She was 5 and her brother was 3. Their name is Chigger. Looks like chiggers, but anyway. And so he walked into their house, and the mother was just shocked and grabbed the kids and held on to them. And he looked at the kids, and then he smiled. And he said, "Don't be afraid of me. Whatever you're doing, I'll try to help you." And he supported them, smuggled food into the sewer, would come. And in the beginning, they had money and were able to pay him and give him money to buy the food. But eventually they ran out of money. And he had 2 other guys helping him who were doing it for the money. And so he and the other 2 guys came down one day and said, "Well, this is the last we can bring you because we don't have the money to buy the food." And so they said, "Well, thanks for all you've done." And they went away. And a couple hours later, he was back with another load of food. He said, "I'll bring you food." And he continued for 14 months. And there were, I think, 35 Jews in the sewer to begin with, and 21 of them lived and were released at the end of the war. And then sadly, he and his daughter went out on a bike ride, and a truck lost its brakes and came down the hill. It was just heading for his little daughter, and he pushed her out of the way, and the truck hit him and he was killed. Now, if you want to have one of those questions of how could God do this, but God knows what, God doesn't do it, of course, but tragic things happen. But his story also wasn't known until very recently. So rescuers, like perpetrators, were not born to a particular role or function. They became rescuers step by step. That's from the Raoul Hilberg book. So what's the motivation? What motivated the rescuers? Some sympathized with the Jews. Some were actually anti-Semitic, and there's a number of stories like that about people who said rotten things about the Jews anytime they could. but they were too human to sanction murder or genocide. They didn't like the Jews, and they might throw something at them, but they couldn't stand to see human beings killed. Some were bound to those they saved by ties of friendship and personal loyalty, while some went out of their way to help total strangers. Some were motivated by their political or religious beliefs. Some felt ethically that life should be preserved in the face of death. And for some, there was no choice. They did what was natural and instinctive. That's what the people at Les Chambon always said. Well, they act like this is such a big deal. Anybody would have done it, but of course, anybody didn't. Many rescuers felt they were simply acting out of elemental human decency. They later insisted that they were not heroes, that they never thought of themselves as doing anything particularly special. But we do. And some of the approaches, how did people manage to do this? And so in this study they were doing, they compared acts of rescue, explored rescuers' motivations, considered the importance of cooperation, debated the morality of disobedience, and which was a big thing for some of the Christians. How can you tell a lie if you've got 3 Jews hiding in your closet and the Nazis come and say, do you have any Jews here? Is it okay to lie? Making sense of the rescuers' flaws, like Oskar Schindler, who was definitely a womanizer who cheated on his wife and his girlfriends and was not the nicest guy on your block, but he hired all these Jews to work in his factory and defended them as being necessary to the warfare. Understanding why rescuers were so few and defining our own obligations. And I guess the reason that this whole thing became to my attention, I'm thinking about all the stuff we're all looking at and the political situation in America and the whole thing with, was the pandemic handled right or not and all of that. But, it's a time when a lot of decisions have to be made and we want to prayerfully make the right ones. So some of the methods of rescue, we're kind of running out of time here, but let's see if we can do a few more. The methods included hiding a Jew in one's house or one's property, supplying forged ID cards, that happened a lot at Les Chambon, finding employment, letting people work like Schindler had people working in his factory, smuggling people from one place to another, providing food or clothing. Each of us is a living proof that even in hell, even in the hell called the Holocaust, there was goodness, there was kindness, there was love and compassion. That's written by Abram Foxman, who was a child survivor. His parents left him as, I think, a 2-year-old with their Catholic neighbors, and said that they wanted him to be Jewish. If they were killed and couldn't come back, please find a Jewish family member. And he was one of the people that the Christian foster parents had talked to their bishop, who said, well, if the parents want this child to be with the Jewish family, then you have to work to find that. And that's the guy who eventually became Pope John Paul II, who was from Poland and was also an underground worker in the war days. So individuals who rescued, well, Irina Sendler, Oskar Schindler, with some of the people he rescued. Actually, years ago, I met a guy who was working for the Israeli embassy in Washington, and he said his parents had been rescued by Schindler, and they were living in Tel Aviv, and that he said that most every winter Schindler would come and stay with his folks for the winter, and because his parents would have done anything to help Schindler. But he said when he was a grade school kid, his job was to come right home from school, and on the way to stop at a bar where Schindler happened to hang out, and if he was getting too drunk, to make sure to get him home before he did something foolish. So that was this kid's job in the early years of Israel at the end of the war. And here's Miep Gies, who of course was Anne Frank's rescuer, and Betsy, Corey, Nolly, and Willem ten Boom, the Corey ten Boom's family. And her grandfather, 100 years before all this happened, had a Bible study and a prayer meeting in their town in Haarlem, Holland, where they would meet and pray for the Jews, that the Jews would come back to their ancient land and all of that, 100 years before all this happened. And then there was the Quakers, the American Friends Service. We talked last week about some of the work of the Quakers. And here's Andre Trachme and his wife Magda, and their daughter. They had four kids, and their teenage daughter eventually became a French teacher and moved to America and wound up teaching at Breck School in Minneapolis. I used to bring her out to places to speak quite often. She's still pretty perky. She's as liberal as the day is long, but she's got a good story. And the diplomats who rescued, that's an interesting bit too. We're getting pretty close to the end here. So here are 6 of the 9 diplomats who were actively involved in rescuing people in the countries they were sent to as representatives. So Feng Shang-ho, he's written a book that's really fascinating. He's Chinese, and he was sent to Vienna, and he rescued a lot of Jewish people in Vienna, which was not being befriended by local people at all. And then there's Aristides de Sousa Mendes. He's Portuguese. He's from Portugal, and he was the Portuguese ambassador in France at that time. And his story is long and complicated and really amazing. But again, none of these people were from places where you would think they would have a passion for the Jews. And here's the Japanese guy. He's the Japanese envoy in Lithuania. And he was giving permits to go to Japan. And there was the Japanese center where a lot of Jewish refugees were housed during the war, even though the Japanese were fighting on the side of the Nazis. All kinds of puzzling and complicated things, but he really risked his life, and they hated him in Japan. But years later, he was honored at Yad Vashem, and his wife and children were still. I heard them speak at Yad Vashem at one time. And then there's the Dutch guy. He's Dutch. Where? Let's see. I don't know where he went. I don't have the stuff there. Okay, but anyway, he was also a fairly well-known envoy. Hiram Bingham from the US was with the US consul in France, and he was one of the 3 that were listed as righteous Gentiles at Yad Vashem for some years. He really worked to rescue people in France. And then Raoul Wallenberg, of course, was the Swedish ambassador in Hungary, and he rescued all kinds of Jews in Budapest, got them on trains leaving, and he was eventually arrested by the Russians, and we don't know exactly when he died, but he just disappeared, and the Russians weren't interested in honoring him. And then there's governments that helped with rescue. Bulgaria, that's an interesting story. I had a cab driver once when I landed in Israel at the airport, and I had to be at a meeting in Jerusalem, so I took a cab, which was more expensive than I wanted to pay. But he was from Bulgaria, and he was one of the Bulgarian Jews who was rescued. And he said the king of Bulgaria really, really helped. He was so glad he'd come from Bulgaria, and he had all kinds of stories to tell about it. And then Denmark, we heard about. Finland also, the government there. Well, here, this picture is the Danish fishermen ferrying Jews to safety in Sweden in 1943. And even in Hungary, there were rescuers. and Italy and the Vatican. It's complicated, and again, it's easy to blame the Catholic leadership for what they didn't do, but many of the Jewish children were rescued by nuns who were in charge of orphanages, and they would hide the children there and not report them when Nazis came to check. Whoever saves a single life saves the entire universe, the word from the Talmud, and the righteous among the nations. This is a list I've had this PowerPoint for about 10 years. And when I started it, Yad Vashem had identified 22,000 rescuers. And now it's up to 27,712. But this is an interesting list. And it's kind of surprising. It surprised me when I first encountered it, but the largest number of rescuers in Europe were in Poland. But of course, when you stop and think about it, the largest number of Jews were in Poland. And while Poland was controlled by the Nazis, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism in background in Poland, but they had the largest number of rescuers also. And the Netherlands is second with about 5,000, France with 4. Both those countries had people who helped and people who collaborated. And Ukraine, about 2,500, Belgium, 1,700, Lithuania, 900, Hungary, 800, Belarus, Slovakia. Well, it goes down the list here. And over here, I had to update the United States because the 2 new people in the last few years that have been discovered, it used to be 3, so that's why the number is out of order. And the American Righteous Gentiles, again, it's one of those things where you would hope that Christians would be at the forefront, but these people are Unitarians. This guy, Waitstill Sharp. Can you imagine naming a kid Waitstill? Well, maybe it's a good idea, I don't know. But anyway, he's a Unitarian pastor, but he and his wife were young people who went to Europe and were really working with, they were kind of involved with the Quakers and the Mennonites, who were also groups that were, but not really large mainstream Christian groups. So I have to say the Christians were not notable for their help. And this is the 2 of them later in life. Varian Fry, who we mentioned before, and he was an American government official in Marseille, France. He was there in the 40s, and he rescued a lot of kids. It's another long story. But anyway, the 2 who've been recently discovered, Master Sergeant Roderick Edmonds, and I'd heard this story a while back too, and actually during the, well, I won't go into all that, but anyway, near the end of World War II, he was captured. He was a non-commissioned officer and became the ranking US non-commissioned officer at a POW camp in Germany. He was in charge of 1,275 US soldiers in this camp. On January 27th, 1945, which is, I mean, already Auschwitz had been liberated at this time, but this is taking place in Germany. And the Nazis, even though they knew they were losing the war, were desperate to keep killing the Jews. And the Nazis were soon to be defeated in Germany. And he was commanded to order the Jewish American soldiers to present themselves at the next morning's assembly so they could be separated from the other prisoners. That was his instruction from the commandant of this prisoner of war camp. Instead, Edmonds ordered all 1,275 POWs to assemble outside their barracks. The German commandant rushed up to Edmonds in a fury and placed his pistol against Edmonds' head and demanded that he identify the Jewish soldiers under his command immediately. Instead, Edmonds responded, "We are all Jews here," and told the commandant that if he wanted to shoot the Jews, he would have to shoot all of the prisoners. Then he warned the commandant that if he harmed any of Edmund's men, the commandant would be prosecuted for war crimes after the conflict ended. The commandant backed down. Edmunds is credited with saving 300 Jewish American soldiers from almost certain death. And this little girl from Indiana, Lois Gundon, she also was involved with the Mennonites, and she was a French teacher. She'd studied French. She'd never been to France, but she was a good teacher, a very ordinary little woman, not somebody you would expect to be a hero. But she was working with the Mennonite Central Committee, and in 1941 they sent her to teach at a children's home in France. And some of the children there were Jewish and were being hidden there. One morning while the children were out for a walk, a policeman came to the center in order to arrest 3 of the Jewish children. He knew their names and he knew they were there. Lois said the children would not return. They were out for a walk and they wouldn't be back until afternoon. At noon, the policeman appeared again and told Lois to pack up the children's belongings and prepare them for departure. This time, Lois said that their clothing was being laundered and it wouldn't be dry until late afternoon. All through the day, Lois prayed for wisdom and guidance and for the safety of the 3 children, and the officer never did return. The children were saved. So she also was, and she went back to Indiana and taught French and died somewhere in the 1980s, I guess, and has recently been mentioned or included as a righteous Gentile at Yad Vashem. So Elie Wiesel's closing comments. Remember that it is easy to save human lives. One did not have to be crazy to feel pity for an abandoned child. It was enough to open a door, to throw a piece of bread, a shirt, a coin. It was enough to feel compassion. In those times, one climbed to the summit of humanity simply by remaining human. He continues, let us not forget there is always a second when a moral choice is to be made. Even in those times when the terror was unprecedented, German soldiers everywhere, collaborators everywhere, even then there were people, men, women, rich and poor, who simply said, no, we won't do it. When I read that quote some years later, it made me think on a very much smaller level of the day I got thrown off the bus in Fort Smith, Arkansas for riding in the back. Because of course, Black people rode in the back. I was supposed to sit up front. And this the driver's dragging me down the aisle by my arm to sit in the proper section for my skin color. And when we got to the side door, it was one of those moral choices. It was just like an epiphany. And I thought, I'm going to hate myself tomorrow if I just sit where this jerk wants me to sit. So I said, if I can't sit where I want to sit on this bus, let me off. And he opened the door and pushed me out. And as I mentioned before, I think, but as I flew out the door, I looked at the people in the back, and those Black people were all, their faces were filled with fear. They just were afraid this was going to turn into a big episode. But anyway, when I read this, I thought, yeah, it is like that. And I'm not here to tell you I've made all the right moral choices all throughout the last 84 years, but it's good to know there are some principles to follow. So this is our ending. The Psalm 24 says, if you falter in time of trouble, how small is your strength? Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. If you say, but we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? Will he not repay everyone according to what they have done? This is the display at Yad Vashem where the German train that carried many Jews to Auschwitz and other places is the memorial at that site. So anyway, that's the end of our presentation. So we've gone a little over time. We're sort of getting in the habit of doing that, but thanks for your attention and hope you found this somewhat helpful. God bless. Elon, it's yours.
Thank you so much, JoAnn.
Thank you, JoAnn.
You can stop the sharing if you want to. Let me see, I can stop it for you if you want.
Okay,
There we go.
there we are.
Yeah, thank you, JoAnn.
Thank you very much.
And JoAnn, I have,
Thank you.
is
Thank
Deb
you,
still on, by the
Joanne.
way? I know she was, Deb, are you still on? Because I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna share with you guys something. Okay, I'm gonna go here to my screen. I want to show you a few things. First, JoAnn talked about rescuers. That's my Amazon order thingy. See, I did a search on Sukihara because Sukihara is one of the rescuer that she talked about.
Oh, yeah. Sugihara.
Sukihara, yeah. He have a beautiful book about him called Passage to Freedom, the Sukihara story. It's actually, I believe, written by his son.
Mhm,
You can see I bought the book in 2014.
mhm.
Actually, I gave it away to somebody, then I bought it again in 2015. Freedom to Passage to Freedom, the Sukihara story. I highly recommend that because it's a children book.
All right.
It's what?
To read it with a child, but I enjoyed reading it myself. So I highly recommend you get it. That's how actually it, you can see how the maybe this one will be better image. You can see it here.
Mhm, yeah.
That's how the cover looks like, okay? And it's a wonderful book. It's, I got the hardcover version of it.
Yeah,
This
it's
is
really
one thing.
amazing.
The other thing, I'm gonna surprise you guys, you know, in 2010, we had a Night to Honor Israel, which obviously take place usually on Sundays. And here's Deb and Bill there, okay?
Mhm.
Showing it to you. Deb, are you there? You see, Deb? Now, the reason I'm showing it is especially for JoAnn, is because that was on Sunday, but the Wednesday before that, we had a special session. See, that's JoAnn. And that's at Living Word. And she was introducing the speaker, which is
There he is.
Dr. Fish. Okay,
Dr. Fish.
that's the Dr. Fish that was in her presentation. And JoAnn, especially for you, I found a photo because that Sunday we actually were doing
Aw.
that. We were doing the
Judy.
Oh, look at the girls.
Yeah.
that was the JCLC.
That's the library. That's when we first opened the library.
Yeah, we opened the library. So that's from that Sunday.
Cute.
I don't know if you even have that photo, JoAnn.
I don't, oh, I'm sure I do. Jody keeps all our family photos, but I haven't seen this one for a long time, so that's a real pleasure.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
just thought that it's related to it was all at that same week when Dr. Fish spoke and JoAnn introduced him and we opened the JCLC. So I thought that to share with you all.